Hello, everyone. We'll wait a minute. Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Giulia Coinaldi, Director of Inclusive Economies at the Thomson Reuters Foundation. And as people are slowly logging in, just a few technicalities. If you have audio problems, please check the setting in your computer. You can send your question for the panelists using the Q&A tool. Please include your name, organization, and specify which panelist you're directing your question to. For any other question, do not use the Q&A. Please use the chat function. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted online. Please mute yourself at all times. And before we kick off, I'm going to wait another 30 seconds to a minute. Hello, everyone. Again, hello from me. I'm Giulia Coinaldi. I see everyone is logging in. So I am the Director of Inclusive Economy at the Thomson Reuters Foundation. And alongside our inspiring co-hosts, Frank Bold and Shift, we all hope this event will be informative and provide insight so more resources and efforts are deployed in addressing the S in ESG, environmental, social, and governance criteria. We are delighted to see so many of you from all over the world joining us today. We're thrilled to have attendees from investment, business, legal community, civil society, and academia. And we can promise you that you will hear from truly fascinating speakers. We will cover the topic from many different angles. John Ruggie, author of the UN Guiding Principle and professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, will inspire us to do more, I'm sure. Caroline Rees, president or co-founder of Shift, will moderate a panel of leading practitioners, Irit Tamir from Oxfam America, Lauren Compere from Boston Common Asset Management, and Julie Valla from L'Oréal, who will be sharing their different perspective on why and how they're approaching the S in ESG and what makes a meaningful indicator. We'll then have a guest speaker, Tom Dott from the European Commission, sharing a regulatory perspective. And Philip Gregor, head of responsible company section at Frank Bold, will wrap things up and help us look forward. A decade after the adoption of the UNGPs, there's a growing consensus that voluntary commitments and compliance are not enough. The event today will take place in the context of unprecedented acceleration of efforts to advance and harmonize sustainability reporting by the EU, by the IFRS Foundation and USSEC. As we look to the future post-COVID, I'm sure all of us will agree that cooperation and collaboration are the key to ensuring a just and sustainable recovery. There is a growing recognition that mainstream economic models and financial markets are increasingly divisive, perpetuating inequalities and impacting the planet in the name of shareholder returns and short-term financial gain. At the Thomson Reuters Foundation, we're committed to economies that are equitable, participatory, and sustainable, and when they respect the planet. To foster a more inclusive economy, we must move beyond the financial metrics and undertake measure of long-term value creation for all stakeholders, particularly for low-income and marginalized people. For years, the Foundation has worked to highlight how rising inequality all over the world are excluding more people from participating in the economy. And as part of the focus on building more inclusive economy, we use our blend of media and legal to combat modern slavery, foster fair and sustainable economy, and raise awareness. And it's the Foundation taught leadership on combating modern slavery that led us to really focus on ESG in 2020. As one of the most extreme forms of labor, abuse of exploitation, modern slavery is a human rights issue and such a part of the S of ESG. We want to lever since we began our ESG work, the importance of the S in ESG has gained prominence and urgency in the wake of COVID-19 and social unrest across the globe. These crises highlight the importance of addressing labor rights, diversity, to achieve more resilient economic model and workforce. Issues as such worker rights, supply chains, and race have been catapulted in the spotlight. While assessing and managing environmental impact and risk is widely recognized as critical for the resilience and long-term sustainability of both company investment portfolio, it has taken the reality of a global pandemic to drive home the importance of assessing company social risk and impact. Here at the Foundation, we approach various stakeholders to discuss how we might partner to highlight the importance of the S in ESG as necessary to achieving a more inclusive and sustainable economy. We're proud to have founded a working group with Refinitiv, ICFC, White&Case, EcoAge, the Mekong Club, the Principle for Responsible Business, and Robert Kennedy Human Rights as observing partner. And after months of collaboration with other key stakeholders, the group launched a white paper amplifying the S in ESG, Investor Mythbuster. The paper pushed back on the most common arguments made by investors to justify the lack of engagement on social issues. The paper argued against the focus on financial materiality as the only measurement of impact, highlighting the need of sustainability consideration to measure a company's impacts on people. It argues the link between business and human rights is well established, and there are many resources to grow understanding of S in ESG. And working closely with experts to adopt the right indicators is key. By using this Mythbuster approach, it provides a clear action that can be taken to move forward, to start deploying more research toward S criteria integration in investment decisions. We believe the time to act is now. We view this white paper as contributing to the ongoing dialogue to develop more robust approaches, promote a better understanding and a wider adoption of social criteria and data in investment strategy. We believe companies and investors have tools and data to get started and believe the success on ESG to tackle inequality lies in collaboration between all players, from standard setters, data providers, civil society, social enterprises, investor, impact investor, expert, company, policymaker, to continue improving the data and transparency. Our paper brings forward a clear case of how integration of ESG criteria leads to improved return, less volatility, and lower downside risk. The Foundation itself aims to continue to leverage the ESG framework to engage all the stakeholders, to foster new approaches and decision-making. We plan to continue to organize events. Check out our Trust Conference in November 17 and 18, to engage also at the regional level, and also develop training sessions to build greater capacity for different stakeholders, such as journalists and lawyers. We also hope to support the ongoing work of partners aiming to improve the metrics for assessing corporate performance on social issues and expand their use amongst the investor community. Hence, discussions like this are timely and relevant to move us in the right direction. And so, before I introduce the keynote speaker, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank again co-hosts Frank Vo and Shift for working with us to organize this important event and for all the work they do in this space. Finally, we'd like to thank all our distinguished speakers, and of course, all of you in the audience who will be so crucial in driving this forward. As co-hosting partners, we'll ensure the conversation does not stop here and look forward to working with all of you in this important topic. Caroline Rees, President of Shift, will take later the virtual floor to moderate the group of leading experts sharing their knowledge on yes. But first, with no further ado, I'm honored to introduce our guest speakers, John Ruggie, founder of the UN Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights. Since their anonymous adoption in 2011, the UNGPs are now the global accepted standard for business and investor conduct, and are why we're able to have this conversation today at all. So Mr. Ruggie, the floor is yours. John, you're on mute, we can't hear you.
But I'll do it again. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can, thank you.
Okay, can you see me?
We can see you.
Oh my goodness, how lucky.
It's fantastic.
Anyway, hello everyone. All 562 of you who have registered for this very interesting discussion this morning. I'm very pleased to be with you. In the investment world, environmental sustainability has moved very close to core considerations. Matters of social sustainability, which is the subject of the S in ESG, still lag. That needs to be fixed, but first it must be understood on its own terms. ESG morphed out of the socially responsible investment movement. The concept of ESG was first introduced in a UN Global Compact report entitled, "Who Cares Wins? Connecting Financial Markets to a Changing World." It served as the background document for the 2006 launch by then Secretary General Kofi Annan of the Principles of Responsible Investing, the PRI, now an independent entity whose 3,000 signatories have more than $100 trillion in assets under management. Initially, ESG was a niche product, rising ever so slightly year on year. But it turned up like a hockey stick in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. It hasn't stopped rising since, now accounting for more than 1/3 of assets under management globally. This suggests that growing numbers of investors are concerned that mainstream finance is incapable or unwilling to do future-oriented heavy lifting. Today, every major international standard setter is rushing in to develop robust standards for the E in ESG, including the IFRS and IOSCO. Standards are also being developed under the EU Green Deal. Now, in these initiatives, the first instinct was to concentrate exclusively on the E in ESG, and then come back to work later on the S. But pressure against this incremental approach has also put standards for the S in some form on the table. This is highly desirable, but it also raises concerns. Developing metrics for the E is complex enough, but rough approximations of comparable data can be produced by combining big data, including from remote sensing technologies, with artificial intelligence. But if the pressure to produce high quality data for the S simply mimics that path, the results will be far more problematic. So why is that? And what can we do about it? Well, simply, the S is about risks to people. Some of these are readily quantifiable. What is the health and safety record in your operations? Others are harder. Was the indigenous community in whose lands you are opening a copper mine consulted? Was it adequately compensated? And harder still, how should we measure Facebook's impact in the genocidal attack on the Rohingya people in Myanmar? Facebook had no staff on the ground to understand local ethnic conflicts, yet it opened its platform widely to all comers, spreading hate speech and inciting violence. In short, measuring the S in many instances is far more difficult and not amenable to tick box exercises that businesses yearn for. What is to be done? Well, that's a long story. I can just address 2 points here. The first concerns the concept of materiality. Here I agree with US Securities and Exchange Commissioner Alison Heron-Lee, who considers the belief that ESG disclosure rules must pass a materiality test to be a myth. As she puts it, it is, quote, legally incorrect and historically unsupported, unquote. Indeed, a recent academic study reported in the Wall Street Journal found that, quote, CEOs who riled shareholders on social issues were more likely to receive compensation penalties and be fired than when shareholders were unhappy about wealth-oriented actions. In short, materiality doesn't get you far enough in the E. Companies must identify and address serious risks to people that their activities and relationships may pose. These may become material risks in the narrow sense, but by then great harm to people may already have been done. My second point concerns how investors and operating companies can be expected to identify such risks. Financial risks, of course, are assessed through a due diligence process. So why not for the S in ESG? Companies can employ the human rights due diligence process prescribed in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. It has served as a global soft law standard for the past decade and is now being incorporated into European Union hard law, which coincidentally will be applicable to any business above a certain size operating in the EU's internal market, irrespective of nationality.
John, sorry, you went on mute by accident.
I have not touched anything, sorry. Where was I? Somebody is putting me on mute.
Second,
can you hear
start.
Me?
Yes, you can start where you stop. It was just a second.
Okay, what I was saying, and my hands are right here, I'm not touching anything. Human rights due diligence is not transactional, but an ongoing process. It includes assessing actual and potential adverse impacts on people, integrating and acting on the findings, tracking the effectiveness of responses, and communicating how the impacts are addressed. It is difficult to imagine how this could be done adequately without engaging at-risk stakeholders, or where that is not possible, they're legitimate representatives or subject matter experts. So my message to you today is that we need to think of the S in ESG as addressing the people dimension of sustainability, which in turn requires more qualitative metrics and more sophisticated artificial intelligence than the E. That's why an EU advisory body has recommended that socially responsible activities, socially sustainable activities, should be underpinned by existing global guidelines, such as the UN Guiding Principles, among others. In the end, it all comes down to this: measure what matters, not merely what is easily measured. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
John, thank you very much indeed for those inspiring and challenging words as well, really raising that point that materiality as narrowly construed is certainly not the sole basis for valid and necessary disclosures by companies. And I'm delighted now to be able to introduce to the audience the panel that's with us today for our conversation around indeed this very question of what the right kind of disclosure and the necessary kind of disclosure is when it comes to the S in ESG. I'm joined by Lauren Compere, who is Managing Director and Director of Share Owner Engagement at Boston Common Asset Management, which is a majority employee-owned and woman-led investment management firm specializing in US and international responsible investing. I have also Eric Tamiya, the Director of Oxfam America's Private Sector Department, who leads the organization's work on business and development, including shareholder engagement, value chain assessments, and collaborative advocacy initiatives. And Julie Vallat, who has been the Vice President for Human Rights at L'Oréal for 2 years and was previously Head of Human Rights at Total in their corporate legal department, leading a team there addressing human rights and socio-environmental risks. So as you can see, an extremely rich panel and diversity of experience to assist us in our conversation today. And Julie, I'd like to start with you because we heard Julia talking about inequality, honing in on issues like modern slavery, John, talking there around a range of phenomena that come under the S in ESG. But I think very often still in this space, there is some fuzziness, some uncertainty in many quarters as to what we're actually talking about. Maybe some default still to think that philanthropy and staff volunteering are part of the mix, which is perhaps rather yesterday's story. Certainly we hear a lot about health and safety and diversity and inclusion, but perhaps people start to struggle beyond categories like that as to, well, what tangibly are we talking about? And I mean, you, as I've just said, have worked for two quite different companies over recent years, an oil and gas and energy company on the one hand, and now a cosmetics and personal care company. So start us off perhaps by just sharing a few thoughts about what in really tangible terms social performance means.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you for this very interesting discussion today and for inviting me. It's a very good question, and very often people tend to be confused, and as you said, it's not about philanthropy. Social has a quite broad scope in the sense that it covers, decent working conditions. So what do you put in place, for example, to close your gender gap? It's about living wage. It's about non-discrimination. It's about making sure that your people have access to trade unions. It's about having in place health insurance or pension funds, and the list is still long. So it's quite broad.
Indeed, Julie, thank you. And that diversity of issues, right? And really then captured under this framing of how a business can have impacts on people, and those particularly severe impacts then that rise to the level of affecting their basic dignity, their human rights. So we've got a broad array of issues that we're looking at here. Lauren, let me come to you. This is a broad array then, and we've heard some really concrete examples there. Why does it matter that a company should be able to speak to this category of issues called social performance?
Thank you, Caroline. I would say that as investors, we've actually, I think the whole uptake of the double materiality of both financial and ESG has expanded quite rapidly over recent years. Frankly, with things like mandatory human rights due diligence being advocated in different markets, investors, NGOs calling for increased visibility and transparency, and frankly, accountability of corporations around social performance. Even employees are now calling for their companies to assess the impacts to people and planet in the way that products are being designed and used. And I think a great example has been in recent examples with the technology companies in the use, the specific use or dual use of certain software or hardware, and the impact of human rights impacts of things like drones, and facial software recognition. And frankly, there's no longer just an S, is there? It is about ESG and about an integrated approach.
Right, so those issues really ranging across an environmental impact can be an impact on people, and the lines start to blur. And as you say, they're upstream and downstream of the company, right? Those technology examples are often downstream as well. Eric, come in on that for us as well, if you would, from your perspective, and why this matters so much.
Great, thank you, and really appreciate the comments so far from Julie and Lauren. I wholeheartedly agree with them. And just to pull back a little bit, I think, look, COVID-19 has really highlighted how our economy is no longer working for the many. It is working for the few at the expense of the many. And it is time now that we rein in this corporate power in a whole host of ways. And one of those ways is by which companies need to show how they are treating people, whether it's their workers, those in their supply chain, consumers, communities. How are they distributing their profits? Also, to all of those stakeholders, right? Are they gouging consumers in their pricing? Are they negotiating fairly with suppliers, farmers, workers? Not only in the supply chain, but also in their workplace? Are they paying their fair share of tax and contributing to the essential services that businesses draw upon just like the rest of us? And how are they distributing power? How are they giving workers a voice in the workplace? How are they allowing suppliers, farmers to collectively bargain, to negotiate fairly? How are they giving communities the opportunity to give that social license to operate, that free, prior, and informed consent? At the end of the day, that's what the S is about. And as Lauren has highlighted as well, it is completely integrated, right, with the environmental. So we can't think of these things in pillars, but rather holistically integrated. One affects the other.
So you really point there, Eric, to the systems level nature of this in many regards. And I mean, Lauren, that puts me in mind, we're quite used to talking about climate change as a systems level risk to companies these days, right? And what I hear in what Eric's saying there is that we've got something equivalent going on with inequality, that we've got to a point now where it's actually a systems level risk that we're looking at. Does that framing resonate for you as an investor as you think about the nexus between these issues?
Absolutely. And in fact, if I think about how we approach our own assessment of companies, we're actually assessing the integration, the governance of sustainability, and how these issues are managed across the board. And so, we look for things like, board level oversight and training on these issues like human rights. We look at how these social performance is integrated into performance goals of business units. How targets and metrics are set for product launches, marketing, and distribution practices. And frankly, we'd ultimately like to see social performance explicitly linked to compensation, especially at the highest levels. And so, systems level thinking is essential. I mean, if you think about the most egregious environmental destruction around the world, like the Amazon or the Congo, is frankly also linked to the most egregious human rights abuses. And in fact, there's been explicit, like almost heat mapping of violence and environmental destruction. I can't say that word today. And I think the concept of biodiversity and the leaning in towards biodiversity approaches sort of indicates a change and a shift by investors and companies around these issues.
Well, Julie, I'd love to hear from you in a moment about that question of governance that Lauren raises there. But first, also, we're hearing here about a huge array of things, right? We've talked about community impacts, we've talked about your own workforce, we've talked about supply chain, we've talked about connectivity to environmental issues. So just ground us here for a moment, right? You're sitting inside a company. It seems like everything's connected to everything and everything is urgent and needs doing now. How do you get started, right? Just at a really practical level, what do you do inside a company to say, okay, this is what I can do today, this is what I can do tomorrow?
Yeah, very good question. Thank you. Just before answering, it's very important, as it was said, to have this holistic view. So, for example, to take a L'Oréal commitments, as many other big groups, on using recycled plastic, etc. It's great, when you have partners in various countries with pickers collecting the plastic and preventing it from going to the ocean. But if your pickers are drug addicts or pregnant women and working in very bad social conditions, you miss completely the point. So it's very, very important to have this, as it was said, this holistic view. And again, as it was said also, climate change is having human rights consequences, or many people, especially the most vulnerable ones, the refugees, women, in remote areas that have to work, to pick waters much longer kilometers, etc. So again, it's very, very important. And to your point, how do you start? Well, in fact, I very often say internally that it's really a journey, a direction of travel. You have to start somewhere. You can't be perfect, of course, in one day. You have to be humble, on the risk you are facing and on the travel. And don't stay alone, because as it was said, these issues are very complex. Some are systemic, and a single company will not be able to solve that alone. So partner with even your competitors, your suppliers, civil society, experts, of course. It's not always easy to find, because very often you have experts on the ground on environment issues, to do your impact assessment. It's not so frequent yet to have social and human rights experts on the ground, but there are some, of course, such as Shift, by the way. We are working with Shift, of course, and other experts, the Danish Institute and for Human Rights and many others. And of course, local NGOs. It's very also important to, partner locally with players that know the local background. So you have to start somewhere to unpack, to demystify, and try to measure what is measurable. It was said earlier by John very well that it's not so easy to measure the social. Quantitative data is not very often enough, It's easier to measure environmental impact, greenhouse gas, etc. For social, it's true that it's more complex. If we take the example, of grievance mechanism, if you receive a lot of complaints, it could be great because it means that people trust your system, but it could be bad. So it's very important to explain and again to build that step by step, let's say.
Thank you. Really, yeah, that step by step, as you say, starting somewhere is more important than being blinded by the light of all the things that may be out there. And Julie, just take us to that governance question while we're with you. And Lauren spoke about the importance of governance of this, of how that flows from the top of board oversight and so on and so forth. How do you think about that? We're ranging from issues right there out on the ground in different operating environments up to that top boardroom. How do you see within a company that relationship needing to work?
Also, very good question. You can't do anything if you don't have your tone from the top. It's right for human rights, it's right for social, for anti-corruption, and for many other issues. So if you don't have your tone from the top, you can't do it. But as you said, it's both a top-down and a bottom-up process. If you don't go on the ground, if you don't talk to your people facing very, specific challenges in specific regions, you will not make it either. So it's really both ways, let's say, top and bottom-up.
Great, and let me come back to you there. Julie has talked about that getting started, demystify the issues, and start trying to measure, evaluate the difference you're making, right? And I think very often what happens is when start seeing activity and there's no sort of sense of how are we going to know if it's working, right? And ultimately, when we're thinking about information here, there's a great need for information about what's actually working, not just what's the churn. So when you think about this coming from Oxfam's perspective, what kinds of insights are you looking for? What kinds of information are you looking for that sense of what's actually working?
Yeah, these are not easy questions to answer, frankly, but I will say a few things from our perspective. And first of all, just to piggyback on what Julie was talking about in terms of governance, so important that the G is part of the S, because at the end of the day, if you don't have those governance structures supporting the social, then it really it isn't taken up by the company in a meaningful way. But in terms of what kind of information, look, we want to see companies that are engaging with their workforce, that are engaging the rights holders, right? And really those folks on the ground, as Julie has already kind of highlighted. When companies engage rights holders, when rights holders say, yes, we are part of the solution that the company has come to, that's an indication for us that things are working, right? When there's a collective bargaining agreement in place, it implies that workers have had a say in what's happening with the company and how they're being treated. So these are the kinds of things that we want to look for and see, that rights holders are part of the solution in addressing, mitigating, preventing these human rights impacts that directly impact the S. So that would be certainly one aspect. I think Julie's comment about grievance mechanisms is also really point well taken. Oftentimes we get companies that will tout the fact that they have so little grievances as an indication that things are going just fine. And of course, our experience tells us that actually no, that's an indication probably that things aren't good at all, that in fact, people don't have the ability to either use that mechanism or don't trust that mechanism for some reason and aren't raising their voices. So actually seeing grievances, we will never have supply chains, workplaces without grievances. We should expect that. And that, by the way, is true of NGOs too. We should expect grievances. It's how you handle the grievance. It's what you do with the grievance. Are you providing remedy? Are you mitigating so that there's not another grievance as a result of that same situation? Those are the things we want to see. And that's the kind of information I think that if companies are disclosing, it gives a sense of credibility to the company in terms of how it's handling these situations, and a sense of, genuineness, that they really want to deal with these issues.
So Lauren, I mean, fascinating in those examples coming through there. On the one hand, a great example of one of the kinds of quantitative metrics that seems appealing, but actually doesn't tell the story people think it often does tell. So ease of misinterpretation there. On the other hand, the value of that qualitative information around the engagement and the quality of engagement with affected people, with rights holders. How do you think about this as an investor, thinking about quantitative, qualitative context? What's good information? What really helps you gain that insight about a company? And what kind of data do we need going forward to get those insights?
No, that's a great question, Caroline. I'm actually going to take an example of an engagement we've had the last 12 months looking at workplace racial equity. And, for example, it's increasingly common for EEO1 data, workforce data, demographics, looking at gender and race or ethnicity, even race and gender pay parities. But what we actually need is more granular information and more qualitative information related to this. For example, what we looked at, we actually had a set of 11 questions across the value chain, but in specifically looking at where there's challenges, wanting to understand what that whole process of recruitment, retention, promotion, mentorship was. And at every level, what was working and what wasn't. And I think, so we've focused more on, so how are you actually, how are you setting your targets and metrics at each stage, right, to advance? Junior level employees, through promotion, or senior level employees through kind of mentorship or sponsorship. And this is the other thing. I think actually the call for addressing systemic racism in the US and in other countries has really almost set a pause and a reset for many companies. And looking at old models of approaching DEI, right, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and realizing that mentorship didn't instill accountability. And so again, looking for the qualitative, quantitative, and context building around what works, what doesn't. And I think this idea of sponsorship is coming out, actually, when you're instilling accountability within the workforce to actually formally promote and be a formal advocate. So that's just one way. I'll just say one other thing about what kind of data we need. I think we need more worker-centric data points and thinking through alternatives to kind of traditional disclosure on things like the number of audits, the number of trainings, the number of suppliers engaged, and really looking at how to get the voice of impacted workers and people and communities through both the quantitative and the qualitative metrics.
So a much more nuanced mix of kinds of information there that we hear about there. And Lauren, just to stay with you for a moment, because of course, you are a very active investor and you engage in those conversations. We're going to have the opportunity in a little while to hear from Tom Dodd from DG FSMA, which is leading the way on the new Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and a new EU standard setter that will be forthcoming. We anticipate there developing standardized ideas for how a company should report. How do you see that sort of relationship between the kind of highly tailored and nuanced information you can go after company by company by company, that context-driven piece that you refer to, and what a standard setter could and should be doing that doesn't have that luxury, that is going to be saying all companies in sector X or even all companies should disclose this information? How do we manage that development?
Well, actually, I think it's really about the management framework. It's about assessing risk, managing risk, dealing with the grievance and remedy, looking at, for example, alignment with the UNGPs, the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, and looking at the governance and so looking at the governance and strategy for addressing human rights, looking at the management, looking at metrics, looking at authentic disclosure and relevant disclosure. I think there's similar to what we're seeing now with climate change and the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures or nature-related disclosures. I think we need that. We need that for social performance. And you know, I think it being grounded in the UNGPs is essential. And frankly, you know, if I'm thinking about some of the, we can address this in another question, but you know, this idea of business model red flags being advocated by Schiff, for example, and looking at how those red flags, you know, how companies are, you know, assessing and disclosing around those potential business red flags.
And thank you, Lauren. I mean, just to take that forward, I'd like also to sort of get views from Irit and Julie around that movement now. And of course, it's not just at the EU level. You've had allusions to the IFRS process as well, and the future international sustainability standards board we anticipate there. Irit, coming to you first, then, you know, same question really as to Lauren. You know, how do you look at what is desirable in that more standardized approach to looking at sustainability reporting and what that can do to deepen and enrich the field of information that's available?
Look, I completely agree with Lauren. I would add, in terms of data, I hope that we start to see more gender disaggregated data. I think that's important. So I'd love to see the standards taking up gender disaggregated data in a bigger way. But look, no standard is going to be the panacea that we all would like. And frankly, you know, mandatory human rights due diligence isn't going to do it either, right? As John has so aptly said many times, we need a basket of tools that are going to really help to grapple with this problem. A range of regulations, a range of voluntary measures, a range of standards and disclosures. It isn't going to be one thing that is going to bring us back from the brink, because frankly, this thing has gotten so big. We have companies now that are bigger than governments. Amazon's revenue is more than the GDP of all but 35 states. Think about what it would take to rein in a country. That's what we now need to do with corporations. And it won't be a one size fits all, you know, tool. It's going to be a number of tools that are going to have to do that. And so, yes, these standards can help, certainly, and more information that consumers and communities and workers have, the more they're able, and investors, of course, the more we will be able to hold companies accountable. But we'll need a whole host of other measures as well.
So not putting all our eggs in one basket, but making sure these things speak to each other. Julie, your thoughts on this question? What are we looking for in standards? What's going to make a positive difference?
It's not an easy question, because I was just thinking loudly, you know, sometimes you have great actions that are working at a small level, you know, having a lot of impacts. And when you want to scale up, sometimes you lose, you know, the impact. And it's not always easy to have both impact and scale on these issues, at least on the social, what we are talking about. So again, we need much more learning and engagement and you know, discussion with experts from various levels, you know. Just also thinking loudly about another social issue, you know, the living wage. So for example, L'Oréal is a member of the B4IG, you know, Business for Inclusive Growth platform, where you have OECD and you have many other big companies from Europe, the US and other regions. And it's good that they come all together, including with the OECD, to have these discussions about living wage, you know. And recently they put the living wage on their agenda, and they signed the call to action of the NGO Sustainable Trade Initiative. But it's a starting point of this journey, how we will measure collectively that, and you know, having common grounds to calculate a proper living wage, which makes sense, etc. Again, it takes time, so you can do that at a small scale, but well, when you are so big, it's not so easy. This is for the big ones. And then you have also a lot of SMEs that are facing a lot of human rights issues and that are less equipped than the big group that can recruit, you know, experts, internal or external, you know. So it's a challenge. But again, working together is the key.
Yeah, so lots of touch points I'm seeing there already with some of the questions that have been coming in from our audience, but it's also a really opportune moment for me to bring in Che Sidanius, who I'd like to have share a few reflections for us. Che, just to explain to the audience, is the Global Head of Financial Crime and Industry Affairs at Refinitiv, which is a financial data and technology firm and part of the London Stock Exchange Group. And Che, I wanted to bring you in sort of as we pivot towards questions from our audience as well, just to share with us a few reflections from your side. We've just heard from all three of our panelists about the challenge of getting better information, better data, the mix of that's needed. Share with us some thoughts from yourself, if you would.
No, absolutely. No, thank you very much. And this incredible panel is a reflection of so much of the attention and needed attention to put on this. And I guess what we've learned from the project with Thomson Reuters and the other working group partners is really that there's much more needed to make sure that there's more data that's available to actually measure the progress that companies are making in this field. And we consider ourselves, you know, a data company at the end of the day for social purpose. And when we actually looked at the data that was available, that we consume, that we make available to the industry, too much of it was binary in terms of you know, do you have policies and procedures on various aspects, diversity and inclusion, labor rights, etc. Yes, no, okay, well, that's the beginning. But I think from my perspective, it's not enough, because it actually doesn't tell you how effective those policy procedures are, how it actually informs behavior, corporate behavior. So it was certainly a humbling experience for us as a company, and it actually really calls for a much more big discussion for policymakers, the industry itself, in terms of what we can collectively do to include, to improve the data, to make it potentially mandatory. And we see efforts by the European Union, for instance, on its due diligence, corporate reporting requirements, and many other requirements, that there's an effort for us to do that. And so that was, a reflection on not only the panelists, what they said today, but also more general, I think, what we need and how we move forward on this topic.
And Che, let me keep you in the circle for a moment there as we turn towards questions, and because I want to kick off with one that's come from Martin Buttle that I'd love to get your take on, and then turn to the panelists as well, because what Martin is saying there is that he has a tendency to agree with the speakers that S metrics need to be contextual, measure what matters, not what's easy, which leads us to the conclusion that metrics need to be qualitative, but often investors want comparable data, which leads us to identify quantitative metrics, right? And Martin saying it's partly the fact that E can be measured that means investors can integrate it more easily into decision making. And Martin's question is, how do you square that circle? So let me start with you, Che, and then I'm going to come on to our panelists.
Yeah, no, it's a great challenge and a great question. Look, this is not easy. We get into issues like definitions. We get issues into like data taxonomy. How do we define that? How do we make it clear, measurable, quantifiable? And how do we then manage against that over a period of time? And when it comes to the social parts, even diversity, the definition of diversity is dependent on the context, the jurisdictional context that you're in as well. So I don't have the answer to those questions, but they're great questions, and those are the ones that I think that we need to ask ourselves in order to ensure that there's kind of consistency, international consistency, there's an adoptability, and at the end of the day, that companies can actually measure progress over a period of time. I know that the European Commission, with its high-level group on sustainable finance, in fact, are trying to address this at the moment. As we know, we've been invited to that group that's actually looking at these questions. But you know, these are perfectly, you know, questions to ask that personally I don't think we're there yet to answer that.
Yeah, great. So important for us to recognise where we don't yet have the answers and actually need to invest in the conversations. Well, let me take this question also about this sort of conundrum between comparability and meaningfulness, if I can put it that way, and the tension between the two. And Erik, Julie, Lauren, I'd love to come to you. Erik, let me start with you.
Sure. Look, there are going to be places where we can compare, right? How are, say, the chocolate companies dealing with child labor in West Africa? Those are comparable metrics that we could look at. The context is similar. They're sourcing from similar supply chains. And so we should be able to measure that. But how they deal with child labor in West Africa versus how they might deal with child labor, say, in the United States, where, by the way, we do have child labor sometimes, is going to be quite different, and the solutions will be different, and the cause will be somewhat different. So those may not be comparable. So I think we need to think about both regional, country context specific approaches and issues. We need to think about how companies are sourcing similarly and where they're not. You have big companies, you have small companies, so there will be differences for sure, but there will also be some similarities, right? And so it's going to be a combination of both quantitative and qualitative data that we need. And, you know, I think as I've been trying to highlight, the more that companies involve those on the ground in the solutions for addressing the S, I think the better off they'll be, and the opportunity then to report on how they're doing that will be much more credible.
Great, thanks so much, Erik. Julie, let me invite you in for any reflections on this point, and I'd like to come to Lauren as well.
No, I agree absolutely with what was said, and I tend to think that sectorial approach can sometimes help. You know, I used to participate in the IPCA, the CSR Energy Forum, or with other forums related to cosmetic or consumer goods forum. For L'Oréal, and it's really important to have this collective thinking. And again, embarking with you, civil society representatives and other experts. Currently, the Consumer Goods Forum is working with FLA, Fair Labor Association, to design a robust system to track, human rights issues. So working together again with peers can be an avenue.
Thanks, and Lauren, to yourself on this question.
Great. I think this is a really important place to identify. Actually, investors themselves are engaging with standard setters, and I think this is really important. We need to see standard setting bodies develop and enhance kind of their assessment and reporting around the development of metrics. And I think some of the metrics coming out of, for example, the World Benchmarking Alliance or Corporate Human Rights Benchmark or Know the Chain on some of S performance, especially in supply chains, is really critical. But I also think investors and others should be challenging the traditional ESG research providers to become much more nuanced and much more sophisticated in the kind of information they're tracking. In order, frankly, to allow for that integrated systems level kind of assessment that we need. I think the one place where investors can start to look at these issues now is actually around alignment. And I think alignment of how a company is addressing social issues in their own operations and value chains, and for example, their stated public policy positions on the same issues, or their tax practices in different geographies. Give some insights without the perfect metrics, but give the insights on the corporate culture and the alignment and the tone from the top. And so we're looking at those indicators in lieu of the perfect set of metrics right now.
Some great insights there on some leading indicators that can really get you somewhere. And also the point that this can't be about leaning on companies to come up with the perfect quantitative insights, that we need the data providers themselves to amplify their capabilities to get insights from the information that's there, because the context is different, because the realities are different, and we need greater skill sets to enable the insights to flow from that too. I'm going to pull together 2 or 3 more questions that I've seen popping up in the list here, and come back to the 3 of you to speak to whichever you find resonate with you. We've got a couple around grievance mechanisms. One, Julie, I think that does particularly speak to you about how L'Oréal, or the company establishes a functioning grievance mechanism so that complaints can be submitted in a trustful way. And we've got a question here that recognizes there are some criteria for good grievance mechanisms in the UN Guiding Principles, Guiding Principle 31, to ensure that affected rights holders and their situation is really improved. But how can effectiveness be measured in that regard? So a couple of questions there on grievance mechanisms. I'm going to add one here on SMEs, which has come up in the conversation. A question coming in that in Europe, the SME sector represents the largest part of the economy. What should be the plan to raise awareness at that level and organize training and education for managers, investors, and consumers at that level, as they often don't have dedicated resources for the wider due diligence? So let me come back to you. Maybe I'll go reverse. Lauren, perhaps you want to see if there's something there that you'd like to speak to.
Frankly, I think with SMEs, maybe even just beginning with the understanding of what a rights holder is. So I think there needs to be more training and more awareness building around what a rights holder centric kind of approach and model would be. And frankly, leaning in on industry groups that work with SMEs to help drive scalability on that issue.
Thanks, Lauren. Irit.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of thoughts. First of all, on the grievance mechanisms, again, grievance mechanisms work when affected communities are actually helping to craft what that grievance mechanism looks like. They can help companies in terms of saying, this is what's going to be trustworthy. This is what's going to work for this community in terms of filing grievances. So really involve the community itself in developing that grievance mechanism. And I think you will see that it will be more effective that way. I also just wanted to come back to a couple of other thoughts based on some of the other questions. When we're thinking about sectoral approaches, first of all, the kind of data that we need is already, to some degree, these metrics are out there, right? We have had so many benchmarks, so many NGOs, so many efforts to try to really quantify and qualify what it is that companies should be disclosing. So companies are not starting from square one, because there have been a lot of there's been a lot of effort by the NGO community to try to grapple with this already. And we know what the social risks are for each sector, right? We know that when it comes to pharmaceutical companies, the social risks are around access to medicines, around the IP technology, around tax avoidance, right? We know where it is that they are impacting the social the most. And that's true for just about every sector, because we've got NGOs out there telling them. Start there, start where people have been telling you that this is a risk from the get-go. Start with those approaches. That's where I would say companies should be starting with.
Great. This isn't a blank slate, right? There's an awful lot out there, as you say, that companies could look to and draw from. And Julie, over to you. I'm sure that the points there resonating with you also on the grievance mechanism point. Love to hear your thoughts.
Just on the SME point, it's important as a big group, to provide capacity building. So for example, at L'Oréal, we are doing a lot of more than 1,000, social audits, for example, and the small structure we are auditing, they are not equipped to pay, this price. So we are paying the price, and if there are non-compliance issues, they will pay then for the remediation. And in terms of buying process, it's also important. But capacity building is key, to provide this to small structure. And then on the grievance mechanism, I fully agree with Irit. There are already available data, desktop or again engaging with many NGOs, depending on your sector or even cross-sector. But then if you want to have effective grievance mechanism, you have to have various tools, So of course, ethics line, speak up, but also, people on the ground, informal networks, partnership with local NGOs, as I mentioned. Then they when they are witnessing something, they tell you, and you would not be aware if you don't have these formal partnerships or even informal partnerships, by the way, just engaging, regularly with your key stakeholders locally, rights holders, of course, it was mentioned. So this is very important to have this variety of tools available that it's very important also to update them, because it could be effective one day, and maybe because your background is changing, then your mechanism is not yet effective a few months later. So very important to have people on the ground, community liaison officer, or you name it, to follow up what's happening, so that you have a very robust vision. Again, you could miss points, but having this variety of tools is very important. And then, even if we are aware of the topics, there still are some issues that are very complex. So for example, gender-based violence in the value chain, in some region, there are strong taboo. And unfortunately, and I agree with Irit, gender is very important point, but voila, if they don't want to speak up, then you have to find ways, to understand what are the barriers to this silence, and again, it's not easy, and even less if you want to scale up. So, but again, working together, I repeat, is very, very important with your peers and with your local and international stakeholders.
Thank you for that, Julie, and clearly a resonance across all of you about the need for engagement with people on the ground, affected people, local organizations that work with them, that have the insights. There are enormous resources there to draw upon. There's enormous benefit to companies from how that helps due diligence. And I'll perhaps venture on the SME question, that's one of the opportunities that SMEs have. They're often closer to the ground. There are more direct lines of communication that are there to people around the business, and the opportunity to have those conversations in the workforce with people immediately around them to gain those insights. It's certainly differently difficult for SMEs to do this work. It's not necessarily more difficult than for a large company in that regard. We're pretty much at time for the conversation. I'll perhaps just come to each of you for 30-second thought as we wrap out of this. If we are to make real progress, whether in the regulatory field or just in the quality of the information that we see coming, what one thing would you say is most important, most powerful in seeing a step change in the quality of information that can drive markets to support sustainable business practices in the human dimension of what that means? Irit, let me come to you first.
Well, I may avoid the question here a tad, because I'm going to say that companies really need to look at the impact. So I'm going to use just a quick example. Oxfam recently just came out with a report called Not in This Together, about how supermarkets have profited during the pandemic and continue to profit during the pandemic, while those in their supply chain are really losing out, especially vulnerable women who are often in informal work. If we're looking at that impact, we need to understand what is it about this business model that is creating this kind of impact. And the information that tells that story, that's the information I want as an NGO and an investor, I would say.
A very on point answer, in fact. Thank you, Irit, for that. Lauren.
I'll just echo Irid. I want to see business relevant information focused not just on business risk, but business impacts. And frankly, I want to see indicators which show that you're using both the carrot and the stick in the supply chain. You know, how are you actually rewarding more sustainable and more ethical suppliers? And how are you doing this together with other sector peers?
Wonderful. And Julie, let me come to you to round us out also from that company perspective. What's going to make the difference and what's going to make it workable for companies?
I agree both with Irit and with Lohan. It's very important to focus on impact and also to see the opportunity and to explain to the suppliers, including the SMEs, what's in it for them. So for example, if I talk about the living wage issue, very often they are scared. They say, oh, it will be a cost, it will be difficult, we are small structure. And we explain that, well, it's not only a cost issue, it's also a benefit. You know, you will have less turnover, less illness, and we come with data. So the opportunity and also the reward side is very important. Risk is, of course, obviously important, but also, as Lauren said, I fully agree with this opportunity, and rewarding what's in it for them is key.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Irit. Thank you, Lauren, for bringing us such a rich set of perspectives and really grounded experiences around this challenging question of how we improve the S data. We're going to hear in a few moments to round us out from Philip Gregor, who's the head of responsible company section at Frank Bold and a co-host of this event together with the Thomson Reuters Foundation and ourselves at Shift. Before we do so, though, I'm delighted that we're going to have the opportunity to hear from Tom Dodd, who will reflect for us on the role and the urgency of the S dimension in the EU context and sustainable reporting, sustainable finance setting. And since 2018, Tom has been the team leader for sustainability reporting in DG FISMA, the Directorate General responsible for financial issues and reporting, and has been in the European Commission for many years. Indeed, I know John Ruggie and I remember him well from the days of the mandate, where he was closely involved in the evolution of EU policy on corporate social responsibility. So Tom, it's really a delight to introduce you and look forward to hearing your reflections.
Good afternoon, Caroline. Good afternoon, everybody. The European Commission recently published its proposal for what we call a new corporate sustainability reporting directive. So it will revise and strengthen the EU's sustainability reporting rules, and the development of EU sustainability reporting standards is really the centerpiece of that whole proposal. Now, I think one very important message in the context of this afternoon's discussion is that the Commission's proposal for a corporate sustainability reporting directive, or CSRD, if you'll allow me to use acronyms, doesn't prioritize. So it treats all E, S, and G issues equally. In fact, that is already the case even in our existing sustainability reporting rules, even if they are less detailed and less precise than our new proposal. So what companies ultimately should be reporting is based on an assessment of what is material, not on any specific prior judgment by the legislator about whether environmental or social matters are more important than the other. That principle is also reflected in our proposal for the development of EU sustainability reporting standards, in the sense that we have said the first wave of standards should cover all ESG issues. We are not taking an approach of saying climate or a particular environment issue should be done now, and certain human rights issues can wait 3 or 4 or 5 years. That's not the intention. I think the underlying reason why we're doing that is that it's quite well drilled into EU thought, and certainly EU policymaking thought, that sustainability has more or less equal environmental, social, and economic dimensions. And it doesn't make sense for a long period of time to try and prioritize one over the other. Let me say a word or two in this context also about our broader sustainable finance agenda, and particularly perhaps about the EU taxonomy. Now, I'm going to make a guess that most people on this call are aware of the EU's taxonomy. It's a classification system for the sustainability of different economic activities. Now, in the case of the taxonomy, we have very clearly taken a climate first approach, followed by an environment next approach. And the question of extending that taxonomy to social issues in the same way as it will apply to environmental issues is something on which no final decision has been taken. The possibility is there, reviews will come, but no fundamental decision has been made on that. Now, I think when I was thinking about this afternoon's discussion, I was thinking, well, is this contradictory? That we do one thing for reporting and one thing for the taxonomy? The answer is that it isn't really, because it is explained by the different nature of the two instruments. The taxonomy is, by definition, by regulatory design, it is a performance measurement calibration system that is hardwired into the regulation itself. The CSRD proposal, the corporate reporting proposal, and indeed the existing new legislation that applies to asset managers and other financial market participants are about transparency only. The regulations themselves don't have any built-in benchmarks or performance measurement. They don't bring with them any kind of judgment. Now, it's clear that for the taxonomy to function, you must have metrics, numerical metrics really, that are comparable and very broadly comparable. And as this afternoon's discussion has confirmed to, I think, quite a large extent, that is currently, and to a certain extent by definition, easier and more feasible for environmental issues, in particular climate today, than it is for social or people issues, especially in terms of creating the kinds of metrics that are properly comparable. I wanted to say also a few words about this question of EU reporting standards development and global standards development. For the avoidance of doubt, and as I heard my boss say the other day, the EU is a card-carrying member of the Global Convergence and Better Global Governance Club. We are supportive of efforts to develop better alignment at global level and the development of global sustainability reporting standards. Indeed, it's hard to think how we could, or anyone would seriously oppose that as an objective. But, and this does come with qualifications, there are certain EU specificities. There are certain things that our both political and legal realities mean that we will need to do perhaps in a different way that will be done, at least at the beginning, in any global standards. Now, alignment with things like the European taxonomy is one element, of course, as is alignment of our corporate reporting rules with those rules that fall on financial market participants and asset managers. Those things obviously need to be aligned. Stakeholders, companies tell us they should be aligned, and they're quite right to tell us that. The other part, though, of the EU specificity is about the EU's level of ambition in terms of sustainability. And one part of that ambition is precisely that we see sustainability in a balanced environmental, social, and people, economic governance kind of perspective. We also see it in terms of impacts of companies, of course, as well as simply financial risks to companies. For us, the people dimension of sustainability is not something, it's not negotiable. It's there, and we must address it. If we want to have a transition to a sustainable economy, and we must do, it must be a just transition. And if it's going to be a just transition, the people and the sustainable dimension has to be integral to it. Now, when you compare what I've said with what we see as likely to happen at a global level, there is obviously a gap. The IFRS Foundation is highly unlikely to develop standards, for example, that cover human rights impacts of companies that are consistent with the UNGPs in the near future. That is also partly because, although we may think climate is a difficult issue and a divisive issue globally, it's not half as difficult or divisive globally as an issue such as human rights. And I think our view, certainly in the European Commission, is that we should not accept whatever might be agreeable at global level by a body such as the IFRS Foundation as the level of our ambition. We shouldn't and we cannot simply be ruled by a lowest common denominator approach. And that is one reason why we do need to move ahead with the development of European standards, because we need to properly address the people and social dimension in that. We, of course, have to tie up the knots. EU standards must build upon what's out there. We need to make sure that all the possible alignment is done, but we cannot constrain ourselves in that way. Caroline, I will stop there. I hope I haven't ruined your timing. I think I've kept roughly to 10 minutes.
Thank you, Tom, and I will take over from here. So my name is Philip Gregor. I'm from Frank Bolt, the coordinator of the Alliance for Corporate Transparency, which is one of the, Frank Bolt is the organizer of this, co-organizer of this meeting, alongside Thomson Reuters Foundation and the Shift. And the Alliance for Corporate Transparency is an initiative that brings together civil society with the objective to facilitate its engagement in this ongoing debate in the EU. We have just a couple of minutes left, so I will try to briefly summarize the event and then wish you the good day for the rest of today. So let me start by repeating something that we have heard from John Ruggie, and the key message there, as I heard it, is that the S dimension lacks in the ESG debate. But before we are able to address it, we first must understand it. And one of the basic understanding there is that the S dimension is about risks to people, and thus companies need to focus on reporting on risk of harm to people, which may turn to be material, financial material later on, but primarily we need to look at the impact materiality. And if pressure to produce high quality S simply mimics the approach in the E, in the environmental dimension, the results will be likely problematic. So the people dimension of sustainability requires qualitative metrics, and that's underpinned by the United Nations guiding principles. And we need to measure what matters, not necessarily what is easily measured. So this gives us some starting ground in the discussions at the EU level, at the international level, and of course in practice of companies and investors. And indeed, these reflections are supported by the research. The Alliance for Corporate Transparency has carried out an assessment of 1,000 European companies' disclosures in 2019. And it showed that while 80% of companies disclose their human rights policy, 50% speak about the risks of human rights impacts they are connected to, but yet only 22% of companies disclose what they do in terms of their due diligence, and just less than 4% support all of this by some KPIs or qualitative examples that illustrate the effectiveness of their approach. And this shows that there is a need for much clearer guidance and perhaps rules in order to enable companies to fully tackle this issue and to provide useful information. Another interesting piece of information that we've uncovered was that around 10% of companies in the apparel sector do disclose their tier 1 suppliers, which was quite a surprising finding. So there's a hint of good news in all of this. But first of all, there are good practices. There's not an insignificant number of companies that are actually leading the way and showing how we can tackle the S dimension. Secondly, there is already a wealth of knowledge and guidance how to approach S, especially when it comes to the let's say salient issues typical in certain sectors, thanks to various initiatives such as World Benchmarking Alliance and the work of the many NGOs. And most of this work is firmly rooted in the due diligence concept and thus in the United Nations guiding principles. And while some issues remain problematic and we can't nail it all at once in a single set of standards, there's a great deal of what we can do already. So that will be my, let's say, reaction and takeaway from the day. But let me say a couple of words about what we have heard from our panel, from Lauren, Eric, and Julie. So first of all, and that's something that Lauren said and highlighted, there is a need for integrated approach. The environmental dimension is connected to the social dimension, and lots of the environmental impacts are connected to the impacts on people. There needs to be an equal attention to the upstream and downstream value chain companies are connected to, which creates an additional problem for standardization of metrics. But most importantly, there is a need for systems level thinking, and that requires connecting the S with the G and assessing governance of sustainability, the issues such as performing goals, board oversight, compensation, how companies set the targets on the S dimension. And there was a really good example of how to approach the S metrics when we've discussed the grievance mechanisms. I mean, when a company reports that it has a 0 grievances or zero complaints, then that is usually not a good signal. So that brings into a question, what is the S metrics good for? And usually, and most of them S metrics, or lots of it, is its primary role is just to indicate certain risks, indicate the issues, to allow an assessment of the robustness and appropriateness of companies' due diligence, of other steps in companies' due diligence. From the NGO perspective, as presented by Eric, there's this let's say dimension of the empowerment of people and of the unequal distribution of wealth in society that has been exacerbated by the crisis brought by the COVID and the restrictions on the economy. And there is a need for more gender disaggregated data. That may be one direction for the development of the S indicators in companies' practice, as well as in the standard. And most importantly, there is no one single tool. We can't just stay with the S standards or S indicators. There's also a need for mandatory human rights due diligence, but also plenty of other tools. And all of these tools need to be considered in their connection. And this is particularly true for the role of the S reporting and S indicators vis-a-vis the developments in the area of human rights due diligence legislation. And Julie presented the perspective and vast experience from let's say from business and from her engagement in various companies. And one key finding is that S is broad. There's no single issue there. There needs to be a lot of issues considered, and we need a holistic view on these issues. And one particular point that I've noted down is the importance for engagement with people, with affected people, with local NGOs, and that's an important factor that needs to be considered in this area. So where do we go from here? And especially in the context of the growing role of the S in the sustainable finance and the process of standardization that Tom apologies about this. In the context of the standardization of the reporting standards at the EU and international level. So first of all, we need to go from bottom up. It starts with the engagement with affected people and with people empowerment and engagement, but it also involves engagement with suppliers in terms of their capacity building, rewarding good performance, and so on and so forth. It also includes the top-down dimension. The S does not work if there's no engagement of governing bodies and if there's no integration in business practices and incentives. So smart metrics in this regard can be really useful, can really provide indications both to companies themselves as well as investors and civil society. The second issue is that we need to figure out how to square the circle, the need for quantitative information, yet the rootedness of the S in the qualitative basis for qualitative information. So we need to ask the question, what do the S indicators indicate? And the example of grievance mechanism that was discussed, I think, is very informative. It's all related to the risks, and the indicators are telling us what is the exposure of the company to the risk, and it allows the companies and its stakeholders alike to understand what actually is an appropriate reaction, what is it that companies need to be disclosing about how it deals with those issues. There is a need for quality criteria, a more worker-centric approach to the data or to the setting the indicators. This needs to be reflective of particularly affected group, and there is an issue of having gender disaggregated data that can help a great deal. And finally, we need to think about the alternatives to the traditional metrics such as number of audits, trainings, engagement of suppliers, and so on and so forth. And let's say disclosures on the existence of policies that doesn't necessarily tell the users of the information how, let's say, effective the company's approach is. The solutions may lie in the sectoral approach. And an example of a cocoa supply chains was given by Reed. It's a way when one can actually quite, with relative ease, emphasizing with relative ease, arrive at some common approaches, especially if the all relevant subject matter expertise is engaged in the process of developing some common metrics, and that means involving companies that are leading the way, the competitors of companies, as well as the civil society, benchmarking initiatives such as the World Benchmarking Initiative, Know the Chain, as well as individual NGOs. And there's already a lot of out there as regards the sector-specific risk. And if we focus on those red flags, if I may use Shift's terminology, that can actually help us to find a way through this maze. Some issues will take time to find a way to solve and put in metrics, but we need something quickly, and then we can continue to develop it. So that would be my attempt at summarizing this event. So thank you very much. Thank you, our panel. Thank you, John. Thank you, Caroline, for moderating. Thank you, Julia, for introducing the event. And with this, allow me to wish you a good day and close the meeting.